Thanks to the East Texas Historical Association and everyone else who has worked to guide the organization through these tumultuous times. Bernie Pruitt, our outgoing president, and Yvonne Freer, our incoming leader, and all the members of the board, and Crystal, the brains of the outfit, as well as our magician, Gary Pinkerton. I'd also like to thank Scott again, and as well as Chief Preuss and Ronaldo De Leon for their enduring encouragement these past few years. But 7 years ago, I wrote that however noble the cause might be that compelled scholars to pursue knowledge for the sake of pushing the limits of our intellectual boundaries, the interpretive mainstream appears to have drifted so far from popular conceptions of history that the two cannot be reconciled, short of reassessing notions of who owns the past. And here we are today, a lot of us circling the wagons here in Nacogdoches. Most people grow into the environments that they make for themselves. And that life journey is either going to reinforce the prejudices that they were born with, or that were printed on them, or impel them to challenge some of it. I would not have reached this place without being influenced by historians. From the distorted perspective of the other side in this culture war, you might say I was deprogrammed and rewired. I'd like to think I was educated. At the end of the day, I'll point at myself again and say, this is what happens when you teach a bunch of Hanyaks how to read and write and think critically. That concerns authoritarians. And it's not exactly breaking news to say that's why these jackboots just keep dropping on you guys out of nowhere. The role historians play in our society underscores the threat of that intellectuals posed to the power elite in Texas that before the COVID pandemic already had a lot on the state's economy and its politics. I had already written that if, as those who study the power elite have asserted, culture as much as politics or economics is central to maintaining power, then a traditional version of history that had lost much of its utility due to its narrow 19th century focus surely presented a conspicuous vulnerability. Scholars failed to get ahead of that. And traditionalists have since shored up that weak spot in ways that, in troubling ways, that scholars have seemed unprepared to address. The restrictions that authoritarians are imposing on scholarship preempts the ability of research historians to produce full, informed interpretations of events that place this moment in time into perspective, without being able to explore openly and discuss the concept of a society that is evolving in ways that involve some uncomfortable values clarification for everybody else, and scholars can't do their job. I don't have to tell you, these are perilous times for scholars in Texas academies. They don't know from day to day where the next flashpoint's going to come from, or even if they'll be allowed to teach what they teach. I do know that in the big picture, we are trying to evolve as a society, and the leftward drift of wokeness threatens the agenda of people on the right. Let me ask, do you think in this culture war with Texas history that scholars ever rose to threat level on the power elite's alarm meter? I believe that at some late date, we're going to reflect on this culture war, and it will look like the field got preempted before it could mount the challenge. Now I've got to ask, is that challenge ever going to come? That in turn raises the question whether the academy owes the public a debate. Sure makes it convenient for the power elite if we don't, right? If such a debate does come, what intellectual ammunition are research historians going to be packing? From my view, I don't believe scholars ever connected all the dots because of the mistakes of the past. The observers came out with this article written in the editor puts these little banners at the end of it. It says, will scholars learn from the mistakes of the past? And will Texans listen if they did? Well, the article really did go into the mistakes of the past. I mean, we had 2,000 words or something. Anyway, but some of those mistakes of the past include the imbalance of producing political identity studies out of proportion to other topics. You cannot understand who we are as a people, who we have become as a people, without placing political identity, at least for the moment, at the center of the narrative. If you read that Observer article, you can see how traditionalists are treating political identity. And it's chilling, guys. You know, they're building the moat around it. You know that, right? Anyway, let me point out that scholars, too, have some opportunities and obstacles in front of them as well. That will make sense if you read that article. I have got 20 minutes here, guys. Anyway, another deficiency is the distrust and antipathy toward meta-narratives. In a practical sense, scholars are challenging the traditional history with a canon that lacks an overarching statement capable of bringing their interpreted picture of Texas into focus. To continue sidestepping this very human taxonomical exercise of composing a grand thesis for pulling the work of scholarship together at a time when your work is being assailed by traditionalists is simply injudicious. Without such a meta-narrative to scaffold the work and ideas of scholars, the value of so many seemingly related but unconnected studies has to be calculated in some other way. How can you calculate that? Well, that's the job of historiographies and intellectual exegeses. But where are they? See the problem? To the field's detriment, it continues to be framed by a 3-decade-old interpretive arc characterized by dated aspects of social history. Phil never rounded the corner at cultural turn. That theory has some issues, but none of them are bigger than not bringing it into the discussion, and I just don't see any sustained interest in that. Some other deficiencies of scholarship include an epistemological core. You know, that center of gravity is never coaxed out of the states formed development and into the 20th century. We don't have time to discuss the consequences arising from the inattention to the politics of history, but let's just say that the field's getting played. Then there's the want of intellectual humility. And of course, that's a walk on both sides, but the arrogance of presumption, compounded by a complete disregard for traditional history, has proven a poor substitute for seeking a new usable past capable of redirecting the worldviews of everyday Texans. Other issues like these might seem small, but they're important. Things like the loss of a conservative balance in history departments across the state, the deteriorating working environment for historians, and even advocacy history. And intellectually, I'm going to leave that alone for now. Politically, it was ill-advised. There are a couple of other problems I want to underscore, although we have time to peel back the veneer. I'm at least going to identify them. And these two are the willful disregard and contempt for traditional history and the bottom-up approach to scholarship, which has exposed some disquieting issues. What I'm presenting is just a random sampler of ideas of things for which there seems to be no sustained discussion. But today, the intellectual genre in Texas is stronger than it's ever been in the careers of every practicing professional historian connected to the field. By contrast, scholarship looks like it's on the ropes, attacked from outside and growing conceptually stale in places on the inside, despite turning out some superlative scholarship. Because of the willful disregard and contempt for traditional history, research historians have failed to realize that the popular culture does have an intellectual arc. And it has evolved in some ways that scholars do not seem to appreciate because they spend so little time contemplating the mind of traditionalists. The conventional past has managed to remain relevant to enthusiasts of the genre, despite the growing canon of work discrediting it. For scholars arbitrarily to reject the intellectual currency of traditional history has been injudicious, and the consequences have been dire. Because scholars ignore traditional history and remain unwilling to engage traditionalists, the historical perspectives informing scholarship would never reach far enough into the public consciousness to achieve any kind of synergy with the conditions of wokeness that thinking people can see all around them. Because of their bottom-up approach, scholars have remained unmindful of work that considers the longue durée and its impact on current events. So the natural question arises, what do we lose by failing to assess our common past in the broadest context? Consider the perspicacity that an omniscient narrator achieves, this passively describing the ebb and flow of societies. Absent that kind of vision, research historians did not see the culture war coming. They failed to anticipate its dark turns, and neither can they adequately explain what happened. Because the bottom-up orientation of the field is focused on specialized topics and truncated time frames, and political identity most time, with little regard for the longue durée, scholars did not fully explain the true significance of the foundational presumption that gives Texas history its meaning. And this is why it is important to place the outs in the middle. At San Jacinto, of course, Anglo-Nels, they routed the Mexican army and they got an opportunity to chart their own course. They were able to chart their own course, and then afterwards, you can look at Texas history really as a record of, if you want, a record of Anglo-Nels consolidating their gains and then protecting them against all comers. Well, today we've given a lot of attention to those comers coming out of it. Their story recounts how people circumscribed from the traditional narrative began to quest to achieve the same rights and privileges that Anglo-Nels seized in a fight that was essentially over after 18 minutes. We can never move on to an even more Catholic view of the past without taking the imperative step of putting the outs in the middle. And because their bottom-up approach, scholars have not made a convincing case that explains why placing political identity at the center of the narrative is so important. Flipping the script depends on acknowledging matters and circumstances often left unattended in academic writing on Texas history. Scholars, for example, should be contemplating the context of equitable change, which should be framing every aspect of the culture war, as well as examining the politics of history that ignited it. Conceiving a meta-narrative capable of bringing meaning and relevance to the growing list of political identity studies also becomes a necessary step for moving the field forward. This presents a good opportunity for some sustained discussions that lays everyone's cards on the table. Because of the willful disregard and contempt for traditional history, scholars have failed to entertain the logic that informs the fundamental attitude of traditionalists. That same purposeful neglect has also kept scholars from fully appreciating the politicization of Texas history and the role of politics at a time when dogmatism, whether by action or accusation, cannot be separated from anything we do. Because of their bottom-up approach, scholars have not invested enough attention in discussing the most influential player in this culture war. You think it's a two-sided conversation between scholars and traditionalists? We got another player in this game that's out-seesawing all of us at the same time. That would be the power elite. Placing this three-sided game into the historical perspective presents some great opportunities for scholars to add a few brushstrokes to the big picture. And I don't see a lot of us doing this. The concept of epochal change in the life of our nation represents the source of wokeness for progressives and the fountain of anxiety for traditionalists and the power elite. And Texas scholars can't quite seem to put their finger on that pulse. This phenomenon needs to be part of an open, sustained discussion at this time when scholars should be balancing every historiographical discussion through that context of a new emerging age. If you don't believe Texas is on the cusp of a new age, consider just a couple of important consequences of the pandemic. If they're on the radar of research historians in Texas, I would expect to see them manifest in conference programs like these. I've been attending them the last couple of years. One of them, the dramatic outcomes of COVID, the psychological effects of fear, stress, and the general feeling of disorder, and the actions those conditions triggered, represented a breach in the social status quo that symbolize an inevitable break with the past. Can anyone here seriously contend that you can smell so much as a whiff of the mindsets and assumptions of 2019? If you're not convinced that COVID speeded up the historical process, AI is about to make that eminently clear, that we are on the precipice of changes that, to me at least, smell like a new age. Another outcome is that the power elite responded to the pandemic by treating wokeism like it was another contagion for which the public needed inoculating. All the momentum that BLM and Me Too generated got drowned out in a tsunami of propaganda. Because of their bottom-up approach, scholars have demonstrated little interest in placing the COVID pandemic into historical perspective. I'm seeing a lot of business as usual. 7 years ago, before the pandemic, I had ventured that because of the momentum driving epochal change, the traditional past would continue making sense only to those unwilling to concede that irresistible social forces were shifting the cultural terrain beneath them. I was talking about traditionalists not being there, right? But then came the pandemic. Without the compulsive distractions of sports and entertainment that were taken away, as well as the jolt of having conventional rhythms of day-to-day life upturn. Because of all that, 330 million Americans were ordered to stay in place and left to wrap their mind around such abstract contradictions as worthless oil and precious toilet paper. But more consequentially, that same sense of bewilderment influenced progressive views concerning the deep-seated or deep-rooted realities of social and material inequality that drew lines between haves and have-nots that were virtually invisible just weeks earlier. And then they hit the streets. Man, you could just feel the momentum. Remember that? After a year of protests and demonstrations amped up by the toxic political theater attending every situation, the calculus of American life had changed in ways that all but eroded the middle ground where people of different minds could meet and exchange thoughts more out of intellectual curiosity than through political filters. We can't do that anymore. Well, I barely scratched the surface, guys. It's time to wrap it up. I could give this same talk and just switch out the shortcomings of scholarship 3 or 4 more times, at least. There's a lot we have to reconcile with, but 7 years ago, I wrote that the future for Texas historians had never appeared quite so promising. Can you believe that? Or more perilous. I'm saying we had a choice. I had speculated that, quote, the relative obscurity under which Texas historians have labored stands a good chance of giving way to some overdue attention from riled up Texas history buffs who suddenly realized that most of what their leading minds have been producing over the past few generations challenges everything those enthusiasts thought they knew. It doesn't take some Poindexter to stand up here and tell you how it turned out. But I think there is an argument to be made that collectively the field chose the path marked perilous because it allowed these shortcomings to stack up. The deficiencies of scholarship here suggest that the field is behind the curve intellectually, philosophically, and methodologically. In a counterintuitive way, this should be a really great time to be a Texas historian. Intellectual topics are wide open, and that's what it's going to take to move the field forward. In a contest where scholars are outspent and under threats that grow increasingly dire, what is the one trump card in their hand? It's the knowledge that comes from expertise. Trouble is, because the many endemic faults of scholarship, that's a card that a lot of times scholars have been unable to play. And so that expertise card continues to languish in the deck. In fact, it looks to me like the field has not only retreated into those cavernous halls of academe, it has done so burdened with liabilities that scholars haven't even acknowledged. Meanwhile, traditionalists are getting ready for 2036 by building a moat around that ivory tower. If you haven't read that Observer article, one of the things I emphasized was that they updated their meta-narrative to fit 21st century conditions. And it sounds kind of convincing. As a consequence, scholars have suddenly found themselves struggling with relevance issues that they haven't seemed to acknowledge. The challenges confronting them will certainly involve demonstrating why a society conditioned by traditionalists to view Texas history as a record of opportunities and obstacles should even take their work seriously. Scholars might believe they had been priced out of the market or out of this contest in the culture war and intimidated by legal threats, but the blame has to be shared to a greater extent by university-trained historians weighted with the encumbrances they carried into this rhetorical war. Once again, some of these liabilities scholars still haven't acknowledged. Well, I've been up here plagiarizing myself since I opened my mouth. Personally, it's been dispiriting to be relegated sitting on the bench to this entire culture war when I had prepared so diligently for it. But my concern this afternoon is for the field. My concern is for my friends who teach Texas history. My concern is for the well-being of academic freedom in general. My intention today is not to stand up here and say I told you so. Rather, it is an admonition to acknowledge that the field has some serious shortcomings that it needs to deal with. And trust me, the way forward will not begin until scholars earnestly contemplate some of the things I've mentioned, along with the diminishing influence of research historians in Texas at a time when their voice needs to be asserted. And, oh, look at the time. It's only 11 years until 2036. So stay out of Gitmo, guys. All right.
Do they have any questions?